By the time you were born into a territory that already had altars standing in it. Some of those altars were built by your grandparents, some by generations you never met, whose names you do not even know, and those altars have been speaking ever since. Welcome back. If you watched part 1 of this series, you already know that the night is not empty. You already know that across every major civilization, from the temple priests of Egypt, to the sages of ancient India, to the watchmen of Africa, the darkness has always been treated as a living territory. A jurisdiction, a place where the most consequential spiritual transactions take place. Today, we go deeper, and in part 3 we are going to lay foundation of demolishing evil altars and setting up godly altars. Here is a truth that most people spend their entire lives never confronting. You were not born into a blank slate. You did not arrive into your family, your bloodline, your community, your city, with an empty spiritual landscape waiting for you to fill it. You were born into a territory that already had altars standing in it. Some of those altars were built by your grandparents, some by generations you never met, whose names you do not even know. Some were built by the spiritual powers that governed your land long before your family arrived. And some, and this is the hardest to hear, some were built in the night seasons of your own life, in your moments of greatest vulnerability, in the years when you were too young, too broken, or too spiritually unaware to guard what was being planted. And those altars have been speaking ever since. Not loudly, not obviously, but consistently. Like a radio signal you cannot hear with your natural ears, but your life has been tuning to its frequency all along. So let us define this clearly, because clarity is the beginning of freedom. An evil altar. What the Bible consistently associates with Baal, with Asherah, with the high places scattered across the hills of Israel, is not merely a pile of ancient stones. It is not a relic of a primitive culture that died out thousands of years ago. An evil altar is a legally established point of demonic jurisdiction over a person, a family, a community, or a territory. Let me take that apart word by word. Legally established, meaning it was erected through a real transaction, a real sacrifice, a real covenant, whether entered into knowingly or unknowingly. The spirit world is governed by laws, and evil altars are built when those laws are invoked. The person who invoked them may not have understood what they were doing. They may have been desperate. They may have been deceived. But the transaction was made, and the altar was registered. Point of jurisdiction, meaning it functions as a headquarters, a seat of authority, a command center from which spiritual influence is administered. Not suggested, not invited, but administered, over whatever falls within its shadow. Over a person, a family, a community, or a territory. Because evil altars do not operate in isolation. They have a range, a coverage area. Everything and everyone within that coverage area is subject to what speaks from that altar, unless and until something with greater authority comes and tears it down. This is the mechanism. This is what Gideon's Israel was living under. And this, if you are honest with yourself, may be what some of you are living under right now. The question that matters most is not whether evil altars exist. The question is, how did they get here? How does a demonic structure gain legal right to operate over a life? Over a family? Over a land? There are 6 primary doors. And I want you to listen carefully, not with fear, but with the clear eyes of someone who is finally ready to understand the pattern. Door 1. Ancestral covenants and idol worship. This is the oldest door. The most common, and the one most people never think to open because it happened before they were born. Somewhere in your family line. It may be 2 generations back, it may be 10, it may be so far back that no living person remembers. Someone made a covenant with a power that was not the Most High God. Maybe they went to a shrine seeking healing when medicine failed them. Maybe they dedicated a child to a deity in exchange for protection during a season of war or famine. Maybe they participated in rituals that opened spiritual gates because that was simply the culture they lived in. They knew no other way. Their intentions may have been pure. Their desperation may have been real. But the covenant was made, and covenants have consequences. Exodus chapter 20 verse 5 says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. This verse is often quoted as if God is describing a punishment. He is not. He is describing a law. When a covenant is made with a demonic power, that covenant creates a legal claim, an altar, that continues to operate across generations until it is specifically identified and deliberately dismantled. This is why some families carry the same patterns for decades, the same poverty cycling through every generation, the same broken marriages, the same untimely deaths at similar ages, the same mental torment visiting the children the way it visited the parents. People look at these patterns and call them genetics. They call them culture. They call them bad luck. But some of it is an altar that has not yet been torn down. Door 2. Occult practices and divination. This door is opened when an individual, or someone in their family line, deliberately engages with occult systems. Consulting mediums, certain forms of witchcraft and blood ritual, secret societies requiring spiritual oaths sworn over things that were never meant to govern a human soul, ancestral appeasement practices that cross the line from cultural honor into spiritual bondage. Every time someone kneels at one of these altars, even out of desperation, even with good intentions, even believing they are accessing something neutral, they are making a deposit, feeding a structure, and that structure acquires legal right to speak into their life and the lives of every person connected to them by blood and by covenant. What makes this door particularly dangerous in our generation is how casually it is opened. Certain entertainment packaged as harmless fiction. Certain apps and online communities built around contacting the spirit world. Certain trends that dress the ancient practices of divination in modern clothing and sell them as self-discovery. The door looks different. What walks through it does not. Door 3. Trauma and ungodly soul ties. This is the door that surprises people most. Evil altars are not always erected through deliberate religious practice. They can be built through pain. When a person experiences deep, unprocessed trauma, sexual abuse, violent loss, profound betrayal, prolonged abandonment, a wound opens in the soul. And if that wound is never brought under the healing of God, it does not just stay a wound. It becomes an access point, a gap in the spiritual covering, through which darkness can enter and establish a foothold. The enemy has never been above exploiting suffering. In fact, some of his most sophisticated altars are not built in temples or shrines. They are built in the wreckage of ordinary human pain that was never taken to the right altar for healing. Ungodly soul ties operate by the same mechanism. When two people are joined, particularly through sexual union outside of covenant, they do not simply connect physically. They merge spiritually. They exchange something. And if the person you were joined to carried an altar in their life, that altar now has a legal pathway into yours. This is why some people leave certain relationships and find that the chaos followed them. The confusion, the spiritual heaviness, the particular flavor of torment that characterized that relationship, it did not stay behind when they walked out the door. The soul tie was never broken. The altar built through that union was never addressed. Door 4. Words spoken over you. I want you to stay with me on this one, because this may be the most underestimated door of all. Altars can be built with words. Proverbs chapter 18 verse 21 is not a motivational poster. It is a description of a real spiritual mechanism. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, not in the suggestion of the tongue, not in the influence of the tongue. The power. Curses spoken over a child by a parent. Declarations made in anger by authority figures whose words carried spiritual weight. Witchcraft prayers commissioned by enemies. Generational pronouncements embedded so deeply in a family's culture that they are repeated as simple observations. The men in this family never stay. We have never been wealthy people. This is just how things are for us. These are not just negative words. When spoken with authority, whether the authority of a parent, a spiritual elder, or a practitioner who understands exactly what they are doing, these words become altar decrees. They are registered in the spirit. They create a structure, and that structure begins to quietly organize circumstances in alignment with what was spoken over you. Have you ever met someone who seems to be living out a script they did not write? Who keeps arriving at the same conclusions their parents arrived at, making the same mistakes, hitting the same walls? Someone who, if you looked closely enough, you could trace the exact shape of a word spoken over them decades ago? That is an altar built with a tongue, and it will keep producing until it is silenced by a voice with greater authority. Door 5. Land and territorial altars. Some altars are not personal, they are geographical. Every piece of land has a spiritual history that predates every person currently living on it. The ground beneath your feet has been walked on, fought over, bled on, worshipped on, and covenanted over, sometimes for centuries, before you arrived. And the altars erected on that land do not automatically dissolve when new people move in. They remain active, speaking, administering the influence of whoever, or whatever, built them. This is why certain neighborhoods seem to carry a spirit of violence that resists every social program designed to address it. Why certain cities cycle through the same patterns of corruption, generation after generation, regardless of who holds office. Why certain houses, no matter who moves into them, seem to produce the same patterns of breakdown, divorce, loss, and despair. The land is speaking. There is an altar on the land. And it has been speaking since long before anyone currently living took their first breath. The conquering armies of the ancient world understood this with brutal clarity. When they took a territory, one of their first acts was to destroy the altars of the conquered people and erect their own. Not out of religious zeal alone, out of strategic intelligence. They knew that whoever held the altars held the land, that the spiritual infrastructure determined everything else. This principle did not retire when the ancient world ended. It is still operating. In your city, possibly on the very ground your home stands on right now. Door 6. Personal sin and deliberate rebellion. And finally, the door we bear the most direct responsibility for. Evil altars can be built through our own choices. When a person persistently and repeatedly opens certain doors, when they return again and again to patterns of sin they know are destructive, they are not simply making moral mistakes. Each return is a deposit. Each repetition feeds a structure. Each choice to go back gives that structure stronger legal claim over their life. This is why some habits feel like far more than habits. Why some addictions feel like something is gripping the person from the outside, rather than the person simply choosing to return to a behavior. Why some patterns of darkness seem to have a momentum, an intelligence, a pull, as if something beyond the person's own appetite is reinforcing them. Because something is. The altar has been fed, it has grown strong, and now it feeds back. How evil altars affect us. So how do you know if an evil altar is operating in your life? Not everything difficult is demonic. I want to be clear about that. Not every struggle is a spiritual attack. Not every hardship is evidence of a curse. But there are patterns, signatures, telltale marks that indicate something more than natural circumstance is at work. Here are 7 of them. The first sign: unexplained cycles. When the same category of problem keeps returning, in different seasons, with different people, under different circumstances, but the shape of it is always identical, that is the signature of an altar. Altars are consistent producers. They do not take days off. They do not respond to your effort, or your education, or your relocation. They produce the same fruit repeatedly, because they are drawing from the same root. If you can look at your life, or your family line, and trace a cycle that repeats with an almost mechanical regularity, ask yourself, what is the altar that keeps producing this? The second sign: resistance at the threshold. Pay attention to what happens when you are about to step into something significant. Many people notice a particular and frustrating pattern. The closer they get to a breakthrough, the more violently things fall apart. A new opportunity collapses at the last moment. A relationship that seemed ordained suddenly fractures for no clear reason. An investment turns to dust right at the edge of fruition. That precision, that targeting of the threshold specifically, is not bad luck. It is a watching altar, a structure that has been assigned to monitor your progress and deploy resistance exactly where you are most vulnerable to losing hope. The third sign: night disturbances. This one is both the most common and the most spiritually significant. Recurring nightmares. Dreams of being chased, attacked, or violated. Dreams of deceased relatives appearing with demands or warnings. Waking at the same hour, night after night, with a sense of dread or an inexplicable weight. A presence felt in the room. An overwhelming fear that arrives in the early hours of the morning, with no rational source. These are the sounds of an altar speaking. The night is when altars are most active. And when an adversarial altar is operating over a life, the night hours are almost always the first place its effects are felt. Your spirit encounters in sleep what your natural mind cannot perceive while awake. The fourth sign: stagnation despite effort. There is a difference between a season of divine preparation, where God is building the depth of your character before He builds the height of your platform, and a spiritual ceiling that holds a person down regardless of what they do. When someone is genuinely committed, genuinely working, genuinely positioned in faith, and nothing moves, there is often an altar operating above them, whose voice carries more legal weight in that territory than their prayers currently do. Until that altar is confronted and dismantled, the ceiling stays in place. The fifth sign: bloodline sicknesses and physical afflictions. Some sicknesses have spiritual roots. Not all. Medicine is real, the body is complex, and we must be wise. But there are family lines where the same diseases appear at the same ages, in the same organs, generation after generation, with a consistency that transcends genetics alone. Communities where certain afflictions cluster in ways that data cannot fully explain. A decree spoken through covenant or ritual can attach to a bloodline and express itself in the body across generations. It is a form of altar speaking into the flesh, into the cellular memory of a people. The sixth sign: relational and marital destruction. Certain altars are specifically commissioned to destroy covenant relationships. When marriages consistently collapse in a family line, in the same season, for similar reasons. When people find love and then watch it unravel with a pattern that mirrors what their parents experienced. When connections that seemed heaven-sent keep breaking apart without satisfying explanation. The altar's goal is isolation, because a person stripped of covering, of marriage, of community, of covenant relationship, is a person who is spiritually exposed. Easier to afflict, harder to restore. The seventh sign: a ceiling on wealth. Some altars speak specifically over resources. When a person is disciplined, faithful, sowing consistently, and yet money disappears without explanation, opportunities evaporate at the point of closing. The family cannot seem to break through a particular financial level no matter what they do. It is worth asking a deeper question. Is there a decree of poverty over this bloodline? Is there an altar that has been speaking lack over these people for generations and has not yet been silenced? The bridge. Back to Gideon now. Now you understand why God did not simply tell Gideon to pray more, to fast longer, to organize the community, to believe harder. He said, tear it down. Because the Midianite oppression, the poverty, the hiding, the 7 years of stolen harvests, was not the root problem. It was the fruit of one. There was an altar in the land, in Gideon's own father's backyard. A Baal altar that had been speaking over that family, that community, that territory, giving legal jurisdiction to the enemy, maintaining a spiritual environment in which Israel could not rise, could not prosper, could not step into what God had called them to be. Not because God was not willing, because the altar was not silent. And now Gideon knows what he is dealing with. Now he understands that the battle is not first against the Midianites camped in the valley. The battle is first against the altar standing in his own backyard. The external enemy could not be defeated until the internal altar was demolished. This is the word I want to leave burning in your spirit before we move to part 3. Your greatest opposition may not be the person you think. It may not be the economy, the government, the circumstance. It may be an altar, one that was built in the dark, one that has been speaking over your life since before you knew there was a night to guard. But here is what Gideon's story teaches us above everything else. One night is enough. One night of obedience. One act of courage. One decision to stop working around the altar and go directly to it can change everything by morning. In part 3, we watch Gideon move. We learn exactly how a night altar is torn down and what gets built in its place. Don't miss it.